Welcome to a quick discussion of Xenoblade Chronicles 3. This has been one of my most anticipated games of 2022, ever since it was rumored in summer 2021. I've been playing this a lot lately, so I want to share my overall impressions so far. As a heads up, I won't be talking about the story or showing later areas, but there may still be some mild spoilers in terms of characters or location names. So far, I am currently about 20 hours in, and just got to chapter 4, but this is actually one of the earlier locations, and we'll basically be running around this area to show off what the game looks like and some of the changes to the gameplay mechanics over the series. So far, I've actually been really enjoying the game. It's kind of like a culmination of different elements of Xenoblade 1 and 2, and it's very unique in its own right though, so I actually do think this has a chance of at least rivaling my favorite game in the series. But time will tell, because I am probably not even close to being done with this game. So as a quick recap of previous Xenoblade discussions on my channel, I started with Xenoblade 1. I got the game like day one because of Operation Rainfall, and it was a GameStop exclusive at that, even when they finally relented and released it in North America, so I wanted to get it as soon as possible because I knew it would be impossible to find. I was right, until they finally re-released the game, first on new 3DS and second on Switch. Now it's very easy to actually play this game. But yeah, at the time, there was no real good way to actually play this game unless you got it super early on before copies were like 50% more than what they should have been because of GameStop. I like the game a lot. I actually recently played through it again ahead of this game because it had been almost a decade, so I wanted to refresh my opinion of it, and I still really like Xenoblade 1. But in some ways, I do feel like it is still slightly overhyped. Like, if you asked me to give it like a numerical score, I'd probably say like an 8.5, when it is considered like one of the greatest JRPGs of recent memory. So I do feel like my opinion is slightly lower than the overall consensus, but I still think it's a phenomenal game. I also played through the DLC, or not DLC, but the add-on content, Future Connected, which was very interesting, and I'm glad I did, because I actually feel like this game borrows some design elements from that. Xenoblade 2, on the other hand, I played also like day one on Switch in 2017. I wasn't the biggest fan of the series at that point, because I liked 1 and X, but they weren't like my favorite games ever. But I went in with like moderate expectations. I actually ended up liking Xenoblade 2 a little bit more in some ways, specifically because I feel like the characters were better developed. And my biggest issue with the first game is the cast feels slightly undercooked, even though I do think the rest of the game around like the characterization is actually still very solid. So because I tend to prefer character stories rather than like, you know, narrative-driven stories, I do lean more towards liking Xenoblade 2. This game so far has kind of been like the best of both, actually, which has actually been very refreshing. So far, I like most of the cast, and we actually have a pretty big cast early on, which is actually helpful, because in the previous games, the problem is you get certain characters so late that they don't get as much story, like screen time or character development. In this game, you get the main cast pretty quickly, like by the time you reach the first major area, which is actually really helpful because that gives everyone a lot more screen time. We have a very interesting cast that's kind of a combination of races from the previous games. So for example, the character we're currently playing as, Mio, is a Gormati flesh eater, specifically. But you also have like Muni, who's a Hyentia, Lance, who is a Mechon, and Senna, who is presumed to be a blade, similar to Xenoblade Chronicles 2. So yeah, it's a very interesting mix for its cast, and I do feel like the cast works pretty well for the most part. Another staple of the series is big, vast open areas, and that's actually been an area that's been a little bit interesting so far. In some ways, it reminds me a little bit of Future Connected and also Torna in that they're a little bit more focused. Like, when you get to Gower Plains in Xenoblade 1, there's a lot of places to go in theory, but then again, you're also going to be absolutely decimated by like level 80 enemies if you stray too far. And there is still some of that here, but in general, I feel like areas are set up in a slightly more linear fashion, and I'm not entirely sure that's a bad thing as someone who already feels like these games are extremely huge and easy to get lost in, especially early on. I think it's actually not the worst thing to have a slightly more guided experience at the beginning. And speaking of guiding things along, this game actually does try, I need to say tries, to fix a problem from Xenoblade 2. So, one of the biggest issues people had with Xenoblade 2 was its tutorials. For one thing, you actually weren't able to like review tutorials after you see them once, but luckily you actually can now. The problem is, this game actually goes too far in the opposite direction of over-explaining things. So like, they basically stop you constantly within like the first 5 to 10 hours to basically make you go through a tutorial. It definitely is better for actually figuring out what to do as someone who basically didn't understand the combat of 2 until the second to last chapter. That is not an exaggeration. But it's a little bit overbearing at times. I kind of feel like it's good to have these tutorials, but I wish there was an option to like skip the tutorials or turn them off. I wonder if you can if there's a New Game Plus mode, I wonder if you can actually turn that off. There's also training drills, which is actually a very good idea. I haven't actually done any of the training drills, but just having these is really great because, yeah, Xenoblades tend to be a little bit complicated. So having tools to actually figure out the gameplay is very helpful. But yeah, overall, it's very much a standard Xenoblade in a lot of ways, but there are definitely some key differences that help. One really big thing that I really like is you don't have to choose a party per se. We have all 6 main characters on the field at all times, which actually solves a problem I had in 1. Replaying it and going through it again, there basically would be times where certain characters would have additional things to say, like to add to conversations. But you don't know which conversations need specific characters, so you might miss out on insight from, like, specific characters. Since all 6 characters are present at a time, you'll basically always see the dialogue when doing like side quests. And in general, there actually haven't been as many side quests as I would have thought, but what few side quests there have been more meaningful. Without going into too much detail, there's basically a system where you can actually recruit special characters as a 7th party member, and these quests are actually very elaborate and actually feel much better to go through than like very basic quests like from Xenoblade 1. It almost reminds me a little bit of Blade quests from Xenoblade 2, but without as many like obtuse requirements, as some of them were very obtuse. There's one Blade quest in 2 that's very notorious for taking like a ton of time in real time to get through because of having to like do a very specific set of steps that require real world time waiting. You also have this like purple wall in the distance that we can climb up. This actually caused a lot of concern when this mechanic was announced. Basically, certain hero characters will give you field skills, but field skills are actually very nicely handled in this game because once you have the hero, you can basically just go to specific areas. You don't have to worry about like equipping the right blade or anything. It's like if you have the hero that lets you climb up these special walls, you can just jump up and climb the wall. So yeah, a lot of things happen streamlined. Yeah, the one thing that I do feel like was streamlined was poorly handled is the overabundance of tutorials. I feel like there should have been a middle ground. So let's actually get into a fight, because we've kind of just been running around for a bit. There are also different types of enemies, which is interesting. You might notice the little sparkles over the level numbers for this one, but not that one. Basically, that means this one will actually drop more items. There's also like blue icons that indicate tougher enemies, but you also have unique monsters as usual. So yeah, let's try to get into a fight. Obviously, one problem with having 6 characters is you will hear a lot of dialogue constantly, and the overabundance of repeat voice lines is definitely still a problem in this game. But the combat system is kind of like a hybrid of Xenoblade 1 and 2. You might notice that we actually have 2 sets of arts on the right and left. The arts on the right mostly have diamond-shaped icons, while the arts on the left have circle icons, and they actually charge like they would in Xenoblade 1 for the circle icons, and Xenoblade 2 for the diamond icons. So basically, auto attacks charge the diamond arts, the circle arts are on a timer. So yeah, you basically have like a combination of combat elements of both games. You also have chain attacks. I don't think we're actually going to see an enemy that has enough health to even allow us to use a chain attack because of just how long it takes to charge up. But chain attacks have also been reworked a bit. I'm a little bit like torn on how it works because on one hand I actually understand it, which is kind of nice. But I do feel like I've been messing up chain attacks quite a bit so far. Another big improvement is when you're in combat, you can hold ZL to access a tactics menu, so you can issue like orders. You also have different types of combos. So you have like the Xenoblade 2 like attack chain where you have like break, topple, launch, and smash, and you also have like break, topple, daze from Xenoblade Chronicles 1. So yeah, basically you have a ton of different elements from both combat systems, but it actually flows really nicely. Again, this is why I'm almost not as upset about the overabundance of tutorials, because this is actually slightly convoluted, but I do feel like they could have been handled a lot better still. So yeah, chain attacks are interesting. There's also an interlink system where 2 characters can perform a special fusion, so let's actually show that off. Like usual, certain areas have higher level enemies, so we specifically went to an area with tougher enemies. So if you press left on the D-pad, you can interlink with another character, giving you different arts. These are on a heat system, so basically you might notice the gauge charging up near Mio and Noah's names. And that's to indicate that basically once that charges up fully, we'll be forced out of the interlink form. There are also, later on, you will unlock interlink forms for each character within the pair, and you can swap between them at any time. So that was Mio's interlink form, but Noah also has a separate one. In general, I feel like the presentation has also been pretty solid so far. I have noticed some issues though. From what I understand, the base resolution of the game is comparable to the previous games, which is, you know, below 720p, but there's like an upscaling solution that brings it closer to 720p or 1080p, I think. Again, I'm not really a tech expert. This is just what I recall hearing in terms of conversation around the game. But basically, what that means is, for the most part, the game looks a lot cleaner than specifically Xenoblade 2, which was notorious for being a kind of rough around the edges game in terms of visual quality. Even in handheld mode, Xenoblade 3 is a lot closer, I'd say, to Xenoblade, like, to docked mode, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, it actually looks a lot better. I have noticed some issues in cutscenes where the background details do not seem to be like upscaled properly, so they look kind of blurry. There's almost kind of like a dithering effect like in older games. But overall, I do feel like the presentation's pretty solid. I feel like character animations have also been improved quite a bit. The music, obviously, is Xenoblade. It kind of speaks for itself at this point. It sounds great. But in general, outside of battle themes, I do feel like the music in general is a little bit more muted, which actually makes sense because the overall tone of everything feels a little bit like harsher in some ways, to the point of the more somber music kind of fits. I feel like looking over in the distance and seeing Uriah, the Urian Titan, who has definitely seen better days, is kind of an indicator of like, yeah, the tone is kind of darker than some of the other Xenoblades. But again, I won't go into details about that. But yeah, here's an example of a blue enemy. This is a tougher enemy. It also has a unique battle theme, which I very much approve of. I actually like this battle theme more, but unfortunately the enemies are tougher, which has the benefit of you'll hear the song a lot more. But also, one thing worth mentioning, if you hold the tactics button, in addition to issuing commands, you can also swap characters at any time. This is new to the series. In the previous games, you weren't able to swap characters on the fly, you can only switch in menus. And honestly, this is a very, very cool feature, I think. But to be honest, after playing, 2 main games, and then X, and then Torn and Future Connected, I keep forgetting this is even an option, because no other game up to this point has let you do this. So yeah, that's an example of a launch combo. From what I recall, the arts for the Xenoblade 1... Okay, so they're basically 2, like, warring factions, Agnes and Kevis. So the characters from Kevis tend to start with Xenoblade 1 arts, like the circle arts. Characters from Agnes start with the diamond arts. So from what I recall hearing, it tends to be the case that the circle arts tend to lead to like a daze combo with topple, while the Agnes arts lead to launch, which is actually very cool because it reflects the style of combat in both games. So yeah, in general, there's a lot of very clever implementations of concepts from both games, so that's been very enjoyable. So far, again, not going into detail, but the story has been good so far. I don't think it's been incredible, but Xenoblade games tend to get going, or take a bit to get going, so I'm not overly, like, concerned about the story. Like, a lot of times when I check Twitter, specific chapter numbers keep trending as people are actually getting to later chapters, so I feel like that's a good sign that people are actually, discussing each chapter in detail as they get to it. Another interesting detail is random supply drops, so that was an example of that. Yeah, in general, I do feel like quests and side content are a lot more worthwhile, even though there aren't many side quests that I've seen so far. Each of the quests, or a lot of the quests, are still just basic, like, get a certain amount of items. But specifically the hero quests to unlock new heroes have been very in-depth so far. Actually, on that subject, another thing to mention about the characters is you have classes, but you can also change classes at any time. I'm not going to show this in detail, partly because of certain hero characters that I've unlocked. Nothing overly spoilery, but again, the game isn't that old, so I don't want to go into detail. So for example, if you want Mio to be a sword fighter, you can set it up this way. So yeah, it's a very flexible combat system, but in some ways I actually feel like it's very overwhelming. Specifically, I'm having issues with equipping gear, and then realizing, oh, they're not a tank anymore, and now they're being targeted as the healer. So I keep messing up, like, equipment and, like, accessories and gems, partly because I keep forgetting to change all of the equipment whenever I switch roles for a character. But beyond that, I do feel like the job system of sorts, kind of like older Final Fantasies, is actually a really cool idea, and you can actually get jobs from the hero characters as well. So you have plenty of classes to actually choose from. I feel like I barely scratched the surface of explaining this game, but I have really been enjoying this so far. If you enjoyed the previous games, I definitely would recommend this one. But I also feel like there's enough, like, separation that you might still be able to enjoy this game even if you haven't played the others. So I still highly recommend this game either way. I've been having a lot of fun. I'll probably still be playing this for a bit. So I won't have final thoughts for a while. But on that note, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.